Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Guillermo Vasquez de Velasco, and it is my pleasure to serve as the Dean of our College of Architecture and Planning. Thank you for coming. Every year, we have the pleasure of bringing to campus celebrated designers whose ideas may inspire us to build a better world. We do so under the rubric of the Charles Sappenfield Lecture, which is funded by a growing number of our alumni. Unfortunately, Charlie Sappenfield, founding dean of our college, passed away early this year, but we know that he would be extremely excited to have Nathaniel Libeskind with us this evening for his lecture on the language of places. Born in post-war Poland, Nathaniel Libeskind migrated to the United States with his family and became an American citizen in 1964. He studied music in Israel and in New York and became a virtuoso performer. But he left music to study architecture, receiving his professional architectural degree in 1970 from the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art in New York City. He received his postgraduate degree in History and Theory of Architecture at the School of Comparative Studies at Essex University in England 2 years later. Since establishing his practice in Berlin in 1989, Nathaniel Libeskind has designed major cultural, commercial, residential projects around the world. These include, of course, the master plan for the World Trade Center in Manhattan and the Jewish Museum in Berlin. In October of 2011, his firm completed the redesign of what is now Germany's largest museum, the Military History Museum in Dresden. That same month, Hong Kong's City University celebrated the opening of the Run Run Shon Creative Media Center designed by Nathaniel Libeskind. Other recent projects include the Grand Canal Theatre, which is a major addition to Dublin's Docklands and the city's cultural core, and the Crystals at City Centre, a 500,000 square foot retail complex that is the centerpiece of the MGM Mirage Signature development in Las Vegas. The Libeskind studio has very large projects in very large numbers under construction right now. And the list of projects in development is even larger and extremely exciting. To say that Daniel is a very busy person is, of course, an understatement. But nevertheless, he still finds time to teach and lecture in many universities around the world. He has held such positions as the Frank Gehry Chair at the University of Toronto, the Crest Chair at the University of Pennsylvania, and the Louis Kahn Chair at Yale University. He has received numerous awards, including the 2001 Hiroshima Art Prize, an award given to an artist whose work promotes international understanding and peace. Never before given to an architect. It is fair to say that his ideas are inspiring a new generation of thinkers interested in the future development of our cities and our culture. At the end of today's lecture, we're going to provide a few minutes for questions, for Q&A. To address your questions, please approach the microphones that are on both sides of the auditorium. Please do not leave between the lecture and the Q&A session. Following the Q&A session, we invite you all to join us to a reception here at the lobby. So please, I would like to ask you now to help me welcome Nathaniel Libeskind.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. This school has such a fine reputation. And, I spent many years in the Midwest, in Michigan, in Kentucky. And I love the Midwest because it has these wide horizons which liberate you to think in a creative way. So really, I feel fantastic being here in this fine institution. Let me share with you a little bit about the language of places, because we often underestimate that really the world is unique. Every place is unique. Places cannot be really just changed. You can change time zones, but you can never change places. And I think the uniqueness of each place has a kind of divinity to it that requires one to get in touch with not only what is visible and apparent in a place, but often what is not apparent, and at the same time create something that connects the story of today, tomorrow, to something of tradition. And that's what I'm really interested in. So let me, if I might, begin with a few words that I think are important to me. One of them is the hand. We have so many computers in our offices around the world. We work with 21st century technology. But I've always been a believer that the hand is such a key thing. And the hand is really a symbol of the connection of the brain, the eye, and the making of something. And if one turns to the etymology, the word poetry is really about making something. And I've always thought that making something, be it a drawing or a building, and that's how I started. I didn't start with projects. I started with drawings. I didn't have any commissions. For many years, I didn't build anything, but I got involved in drawings. And I thought, even without a client, without a social program, without a place, I thought, drawings could open the world of architecture. And indeed, that's not a new thought, because I recently came across Michelangelo's advice to his nephew, who wanted to be an architect. And he said, to be an architect, Michelangelo, one of the greats, said, you don't need to do very much. You need to just draw. By the way, Le Corbusier said something similar. To be an architect, all you need to do is travel around and read a couple of good books. So that's interesting. And I drew different things. There are different series of drawings, different series of elements. And I also constructed things. I was interested in, making machines. And these are kind of, maybe look primitive, these machines. But that's one of the things that the great Vitruvius, the oldest text, tells us. Architects should not only build cities and design buildings, should be able to build machines. And I delved into the writing machine, the reading machine, the memory machine. It was part of the process of getting in touch with architecture. And of course, I generate all my work in a very humble way, just with a pencil, with a piece of paper. And that's my belief, that the handcrafted notion of architecture is alive. It's not just something in the past. It's always something in the future, because it's based on the human mind. And another thing that I'm very interested in is memory, because memory is not just a footnote to architecture in my view. It's the fundamental dimension. Without memory, there would be no architecture. Memory is architecture itself. And if architecture has amnesia, if it is abstract, without being able to tell something, then we would really lose our way. And so I believe that memory is something of the fundamental dimension in our field. When I designed my first project, which was the Jewish Museum in Berlin, by the way, it was not called that. The project went through many different governments, many different names. But I was interested in what was not visible in Berlin, which was what happened through the extermination, the disappearance of Jews of the city, and murder of not just 6 million Jews, but 50 million other people. So I tried to find an invisible structure, a star that shines with a light that you cannot see in that beautiful city today, but is underpinning that city itself. And I created really a very unusual building, because it's not a building which is built on existing typologies. It was not just a museum. I reinvented the program, because in fact, it was not a program for the Jewish Museum at that time. It was just called an extension to the Berlin Museum in the Jewish department. But what I was interested in is not to departmentalize history, but to show the core of it, which is often tragic, through the void. How does the future progress through building a building that can tell that story? And you can see the old building to the right, the Baroque building, with its addition also, and the building itself. the two buildings, the Jewish Museum, which is standing in Berlin, tells a story that is not an easy story to tell. Because how do you tell that story? You cannot tell it through just the artifacts. You have to tell it through the building itself. So next to the Baroque building is the new building, and it doesn't really have conventional windows. It doesn't have conventional floor plates. It doesn't have a conventional circulation. It doesn't have an atrium in the middle, but something quite different. You enter really into the Baroque building, and you descend deep into the underground, and you're connected to the new building totally underground. And that's sort of what you see, the roads that intersect. And I thought that's important because at the height of the Enlightenment in Berlin, really have a darkness. And not only that, but you have to know that in 1933, 1939, and later, Jewish cemetery stones were used to pave the subways of Berlin. So the underground, without light, tells the story. And there is a form there, a building, which I designed, which was not part of the program. It was not easy to build it, which I call the Holocaust Tower, Holocaust Void. It's not a place that is heated in the winter. It's not cooled in the summer. It has nothing to be exhibited. It's just a raw structure that reverberates not only in terms of the history that you know, but in terms of the history that is still there. And it has this sharp aperture of light, which I actually created at the very last moment. You know, for the longest time, I thought there is no light. When you talk about the Holocaust, extermination, there is really no light possible. But I read, and I have to tell you this, an account of a survivor of one of the concentration camps who said in her testimony much later on in Brooklyn that when she was shot into the cattle cars, she saw through the crack, a crack of light. She didn't know what it was. It could have been just a crack of white light of an airplane or just a crack of light between the deportation cars, and that's the light to which she held on. And she believed that her survival depended on hanging on to something so ineffable. And I actually created this slash. It's a difficult space to show, through photography, but it is one of the key moments of the story, and as is the Garden of Exile. This is a symbolic garden. The earth is in the columns, grows upwards. It gives you a very different, it's tilted, it gives you a sensation of being on a ship, a city displaced from its own history, and it's also part of the experience, exile, destruction, but also hope, because in those cuts, which bring light into the building, it's the projected really map of Berlin. It's that star matrix, which I started just through certain names of famous Berliners and non-Jews and non-Jews, the Schoenbergs, the Schleiermachers, the Albert Einsteins, the E.T.A. Hoffmans, bringing a strange and new light into the structure of the building, and the memory void itself, which really is the center of the building. It's an interrupted space which you cannot really enter except as an absent space, because no amount of fragments of that history can tell you about the spiritual carriers of history, which are people, human beings, who are not there to tell that story. And yet, it's a space that I think has to do with moving people's minds towards the present. And the present is full of opportunities. Berlin is a beautiful city. I was able to build this glass court, a kind of sukkah in the courtyard of the Baroque building, because when I first started, there was no program for a restaurant. There was no program for gatherings. So the important thing is to create something that moves, that can bring life to a community. It can move a community ahead. And just recently, I was able to construct on the other side of the street the Learning Academy, which is partly in the old flower market across the street, because there's so much interest now. You know, millions of people come to this museum to learn about what happened in their city, in their country. And I created a work, actually my own idea, and I appreciate that they allowed me to do it. It's inscribed in Arabic and Judeo-Arabic, in which it was written in German and in English and in Hebrew. The words of a philosopher 1,000 years ago, Moses Maimonides, who said such an incredible statement: "Hear the truth, whoever speaks it." And I inscribe it. It's in Kreuzberg in Berlin, an area of many immigrants from Turkey and others. It's really about the future, not just about the irreversibility of the past. And here it is, a building, can, in its own modest way, recreate the perception of a city. And that's what's important. It's not important just to think of big projects, but the spiritual aspect of how memory can recreate. And Berlin is a fantastic city. It's a city of the future in many ways. City with a heavy sense of absence, but a city that one has to give hope through this catastrophic history, and that's, I think, what the building is. Another word that I often think of, because as a musician once, overture, because an overture is a beginning of something. It has to give you really almost the tonality. If you listen to overture by Mozart to, I don't know, Don Giovanni or something, you hear the entire structure of the opera in it. And of course, I had a chance to create such an overture in Dublin on the Grand Canal, which is the old Docklands, which you can see when I first started, it was a very, very damaged site, a post-industrial site, kind of nothing there. And now, by creating a piazza, and I think that's the important, the creation of social space, space for others, space where people can gather. And because it was a private-public partnership, I was able to create two large office buildings and be able to create a theater. This theater is very low-cost theater. It has 2,200 seats. It's not a big deal to design a very expensive concert hall, but it's a big deal to design a very inexpensive, good concert hall, which can bring people to the center of the city. And you can see here the two office blocks, which really hinge modern 21st century office blocks. By the way, the street is called, it's Dublin, Misery Hill. That's what it was called. And yet, today, on the Ship Canal, I worked with Martha Schwartz on the landscape. It's really a huge new magnet. And of course, you know that the Dublin is a center of culture, center of music, center of literature. And this has become really a hub. Now, Google and Facebook, many great companies are moving right into this area, not to mention YouTube. And you can see the piazza, you can see the developments around. So again, to transform a place, to make a place, to give it a sense of history, because these are the Docklands. This is where the city developed from. At the same time, you can see that it created a very small footprint. The theater occupies the minimal footprint, really, with the back of the house, not grand bourgeois lobby, small, interesting vertical lobby, and really elegant places. It's a high theater. And what I'm most proud is that the acoustics, really, the key to a great space like this for 2,200 people is acoustics. And I can say that you can stand in the center of that stage without a microphone and be heard everywhere. And so it's really a very, very successful and beloved theater. It has this kind of dramatic curtain, because I wanted to create that curtain on the, give the character of the place, which is complex. It's folded. You can see the different levels. There are different bars and restaurants on different levels. But again, small footprint, public-private partnership, and something that can really be built and bring the verve of culture into a great city. Unexpected is an easy word to use, but I really believe that architecture should bring something unexpected. And I had a chance to do that when I drew this plan. There was a competition for one of the largest shopping centers in the world in Switzerland. And there were, experts in shopping. I'm an expert in shopping, but I don't know anything about shopping centers. So I thought, what could one do? What could one do to create an interesting, it's really right on the entrance to the capital, Bern. It's a green field. There are some big Corbusian buildings around, but it's very close. So I decided to build it on top of a highway. And you can see partly it's this green zone, and it's periphery of the city. I thought one should concentrate it and create really a hub rather than the sprawl of peripheral facilities. Interesting project that gives a character. There's a hotel. There are many, many different facilities here. You can see that I bridged the highway because it's a good way to use air rights of the highway and bring people across. And the programs are really myriad of programs. This is during the construction still. You can see that you go through, and there's the complex is really a city in itself, actually, develops around you. Just to give you a sense in plan, it's really very efficient boxes, but they have within them an interesting labyrinthine-like circulation that shifts the paradigm of what a shopping center is. And that's what I wanted. I wanted this shopping center to feel more like a museum than a shopping center, and really create a totally different ambience for visitors. You can see here we've got the multiplex cinemas, the hotel, housing for the elderly is part of the scheme. There are baths and spas. There are food courts, many things. But you can see that the ambience is not exactly that of a shopping. I brought daylight, which is only now beginning to come. People beginning to realize that it's not good to give illusions to people and exploit their pocketbooks. It's better to give them a place to be, to meet their friends, and to do something interesting. So you can see that the effort, architecture effort, was great, and I'm glad that it became the most profitable shopping center. Switzerland has very good shopping centers, but it's on the highway to Austria, to Italy, to Germany. So it's on a main highway. So rather than people just stopping to have a cup of coffee, people stop for a few days. There's enough to do. And that's part of the idea of creating an economic hub here on the highway. And I created also these mega entertainment and health facilities. These are spas. There are Roman spas. There are Greek spas. There are Oriental spas, which at night turn into nightclubs and are used really 24/7. And you can see that they are more like cathedrals than just places to swim. Very large scale, very effective. And so you can go, you can drop the kids off, you can shop, you can go to the cinema. You can spend an entire time in this thing. And I think it's about the social space, which is offered in this periphery of the city, which, of course, is a beautiful city. I also created a new piazza. This looks a little bit empty, but there's a new train station, and this is becoming a new hub for the city itself. And you can see it here as a complex, beyond the complex on the highway, an icon that doesn't subvert the shopping in the old medieval city. On the contrary, many of the retailers were scared that building such a large place would detract from people shopping in the historical city. On the contrary, the synergy has created a better economy for all the facilities in town. Archipelago is a notion I was always interested in, because I always was interested in the Greeks. You know, the Greeks lived on these islands, archipelago. They had the freedom and at the same time the distance from others, and had to assert their identity within a kind of sea of common interest. And I used this idea to design really a whole city. In Seoul, in Korea, this is one of the mega cities of the world. I don't know, 20 million people live in Seoul. This is not in the suburbs. Right in the center of the Han River, with Nam Mountains in the back, at these great railway yards. You know, the Korean Rail wanted to move their railway station. And you see the big railway station, Yongsan Railway Station, is in the center, biggest hub of Korea, really in the middle of Seoul city. So what does one do? How does one go about it? I don't have much time to explain it, but I based it on a human scale, and I based it on history. Because the Shilla crown, one of the famous dynasties of Korea, which created the first musical notation, first cultural sense of government, first sense of recording history, first sense of having the kings accountable to the public. I use really that concept to create a city. Now, many architects, even famous ones, impose a plan, a foreign plan. You know, you go to Dubai and you see a piece of Manhattan imposed on Dubai. You know, you go somewhere, people say, oh, I like Barcelona, let's put Barcelona here. I never believed in that. You have to just start sort of on the left with the ideal grid. Let's say the ideal rational way to distribute a community. And then, of course, it's as you go, you know, sort of like a cartoon, right? There are effects. There, the big station has a big impact. And then there is, you have to break such a big scheme in which thousands, hundreds of other people will live and work, and create a valley where you can create a sense of continuity towards the waterfront. You have to create neighborhoods, green. You have to shift into a 21st century mode, because this is ex nihilo. This is going to be built not by small houses becoming bigger, but it is going to be a city of skyscrapers from the very beginning. So there it is. I used that strategy to create really a kind of organic plan in which nature would connect in this high density volume different neighborhoods, which of course have office towers, have residential, have cultural, have mega retail components. And I also base them on the elements, you know, because give the plan an interesting a way for many fine architects to explore. There's a master plan. So there's the sky, right, which is the mega office towers right next to the station, a fire, entertainment district. There's the metal. There's the earth buildings, residential buildings near the Han River, the waterfront itself, and so on. So a strategy for how to think of something, starting with really a person walking through this high-density neighborhood. And you can see the disposition of buildings is not really sort of abstract, because it has to relate to the traditional streets that are connected. There's a big electronics mark, one of the biggest in the world. There are the small-scale buildings. There are the big buildings fronting the canal, the river itself. Just to give you a sense, there are about 25 of world's huge towers with different programs. You can see the scale of the project, and I think what's important is the infrastructure. So much of it is underground, and in order to carve the space, to accommodate really the different activities, you really have to use space three-dimensionally. And I focus here closer just to show you how much density and spatiality a plan has to create in order also to create good new infrastructure. You can see an idea from Leonardo da Vinci where all the infrastructure is accessible on a single level. And of course, it goes, I think, 7 levels down with its own trains down below. Think about it. It's a whole city in itself. So, of course, developed by architectural models, very simple ones, into the master plan itself with all its facilities. And, you know, with 20 or so world-renowned architects, each one having a building, a part of this. You can see the space. These are renderings giving you the sense that at the end it's about social place. Creating a place is not just mega towers and just high density, but a sense that people can come together, can enjoy, plus, of course, really creating a 21st century city. So you can see various areas, but this is all along that valley that connects you to the waterfront. And one of my own buildings, an unusual office tower with really based on nature. And also, you can see that in section, it brings really interesting amenities to the office. And these dancing towers, and I want to say that these are not shaped towers cleverly done by computer. What I wanted to show you is that they are really made, it's a structural system that allows, which I developed with Arab, which allows you to change the shape of a tower because the tower has no columns. It's based on a central concrete core, a kind of thin system, which allows you to have views all around and be very flexible in the kind of apartments you're offering. So, yeah, it's not from aesthetic point of view that it's dancing. It's dancing from a structural and economic and also, of course, functional point of view of being able to do good apartments. So there it is, Archipelago, with its sense of social sense. Urbane is another word which I often think. You know, urbane means sophisticated. It means urban. And the world is becoming urban, as you well know. In the 21st century, most of the world will become urban. And I had a chance to work in a beautiful city in Düsseldorf. It's a city in Germany, which there was a competition for probably the most important site. That big green avenue is the King's Way, the Königsallee, ending on a park, which is the Opera House, some of the most important buildings on this beautiful park. The 2 blocks were never built, and the city decided to complete the ensemble of buildings by building 2 large blocks with offices, retail, department stores, and so on. And I won this competition with this scheme. You can see it. There's a plaza behind it, an important public space. But it's how to shape public space with buildings while at the same time making really buildings that work. So here it is. Here is the park, the water, the grand buildings, the 2 blocks shaped in a very specific way, shadow plots to the south, the park to the north. How do you create this sense of place? So very strict parameters in Germany. You can't just build what you want. The height is given, the shape of the outline, where the building has to meet the edge of the city. But what can you do? So everything was given, but I decided the offices can't really face the park, be exactly as they were predicted to be, but I had these large cuts of greenery which will enliven and bring sense to space. I was just there a couple of weeks ago where it's not completely finished, but the department store open, and you can see it here, creating a really promenade and a connection to the historical city at this place, and framing shadow plots and another important public space to the south through the building, which of course has also connections on the upper level. So again, the urbane sense of quality in a city, of elegance, and in this case, my client had enough money for me to be able to use actually travertine. It's Roman travertine, so the building has a complex pattern, but it's an efficient modern construction. There it is, how it will look when the vegetation can grow. And this is not just some small vegetation, it's a large-scale sculptures that contain an entire water and irrigation system. And that's hard to bring into the facade of a building, which is available both to people in the building and to people outside of the building, a kind of work of art in which nature, changing plant forms, changing seasons can be represented in the building itself. And you can see it here, it's beginning to grow. Right now it looks very modest, but it will be very lush in a while, and it will really create, I think, a very spectacular sense for people lucky enough to work in the buildings, but also give a sense of elegance to the park. And of course, Düsseldorf is a very, very sophisticated city with a lot of historical building. So here it is on the other side, the creation of again, how do you break up the scale of such a large development and give it interest in light and in function? So rather than making two large blocks that are oppressive, I was interested in the sinuous line, the different shading devices depending where the buildings are standing in terms of orientation. So to make a sustainable building is to remember many things: how the building is built, what are the materials, where is it facing, and how the technology works. So that's a project that I believe has to do with the urbane, which is a quality of the mind, not only of the heart. Expressive is a word that is seldom used in architecture in a positive way. Most people think expressive is good in music, it's good in theater, it's good in film, it's good in literature. But when it comes to architecture, everybody just wants neutrality, which I've never been a fan of anything neutral. I don't like neutrality. I don't like neutral boxes. I don't like neutral countries. I don't like anything neutral. So yes, so expressive is important. And I had a chance. I had a couple of clients who came to ask me to do a house, and I'd never done a house before. And I started with big projects. This is the first time I had a chance to do a house, a kind of quintessential architecture project that we all love. And the house is in Connecticut. It's not a big house, a small house. And you can see it's in this incredible landscape with two very prominent trees. It's built in stainless steel completely on the exterior, kind of like a Ferrari, but it really picks up the color of landscape. Sometimes the building is blue because all the walls are sort of continuous and canted in different ways. So the light is always changing. The building does not have a constant color. Sometimes it's brown, sometimes it's black, sometimes it's very yellow light. It depends also on the seasons. And you can see the plan. It's a modest flowing plan. It's not built out of columns. It's just a folded wall. And I had a very specific assignment because these clients of mine are experts in art and they have big collections of art. But they said, we don't want to have art in our building here. We want the building to inspire us, to be the artwork. We have plenty of art in our place in New York and in Hamptons, whatever. This we want just for meditation and inspiration. What a great project to work. And I worked very closely with my clients. How should the kitchen work? How do they want to live? How do they want the building to look in the morning when they get up, to eat breakfast? So you have to work very closely with the client to create, I think, something interesting. You can see the form of the outside, which is stainless steel, comes emphatically into the building. The building inside is made out of huge oak. It's completely a wooden building inside. So it has a kind of duality, a very warm, cave-like interior with an extremely modern exterior. And I think that's what they liked. You can see I also was lucky enough to be able to build all the furnishings, everything in the building, and even the shower, and now all the things that a house should have. And the bedroom, you can see that the forms are really flowing. They are sharp forms, however, and it doesn't have big picture windows because to make a sustainable building, you don't want just large openings arbitrarily. You want to just open the building to different times of day, in the winter, in the summer, to protect the building, give it a good light and a good sense with its porches, which it has. So that's something that I'm very proud of because my clients said they love this house. And that's probably the best accolade an architect could do. It's one thing to get a house photographed in a magazine, another one to say that the clients love to be in the house, love to live there, and that's part of what working with clients is all about. Singular is a word I like. It's a word in astrophysics. Stephen Hawking says that singularity, and my son is a theoretical astrophysicist, so he explained to me a little bit. But what does it mean in architecture? And I have a high-density site. How do you bring singularity when you have thousands and thousands of units of living? And I think that's something that I'm very interested in. When I was working in Singapore, which is a very small place, to create a mega project. The land is very expensive, so you have to put incredible amount of density on a small piece of land. But you can see that on this harbor, on this bay, which was also like the Docklands in Dublin, just an industrial bay, coming back into housing. So I built these 6 towers and those low buildings on the left, you can see, which are still not really small buildings anyway. And I tried to create a boardwalk, a sense of promenade along these old docklands, and really site every building in a specific way to take advantage of the view and to give a singular view, singular sense of living in each one of these buildings. The buildings are doubly curved, the high towers. It's really unprecedented, to have a building which is not just where an elevation is curving, but the entire apartment is not exactly stacked equally below above. You kind of float in that space. And I have to say, people like it because it was sold and became really successful in minutes. People like to have a variety, something different, not just to be in an extrusion. And I think that's part of creating almost a Baroque sense of space, a kind of theater of views, theater of interaction with other neighbors, and of course the green spaces, which have to be used to maximum potential in the site. I also was able to build clubhouses, restaurants, amenities for people on the boardwalk, and luckily I'm also asked to do another site just adjacent to it to extend this project, so really to utilize the entire waterfront. You can see that by building these doubly curved towers, I was able to save a lot of space. Instead of just building and exploiting the entire green space, was able to leave as much possible open space, which I think is very important, particularly in dense countries, whether it's China, Singapore, Asia in general. And create the bridges, which are green bridges, which are shared by neighbors, which have all sorts of public amenities in them. And really create an iconic sense that it's not only a museum or a town hall or a concert hall that is important, but we should celebrate everyday life. And I believe that that's a huge challenge, that the notion of housing as a kind of statistical subdivision of individuals into numbers is wrong. Each person deserves a special space, a special view, a special care. And I do believe in the individual. Despite the fact that this has, 3,000 units, each person should and does have a very singular place in this building. Political is another word which architects don't like. But everything in architecture is political, because politea means the city. Everything is affected. Even to do a small house in Connecticut, you need permission of all the neighbors to build it there. Everybody has to approve it. So architecture is a deeply political act. And when working on the Military History Museum in Dresden, I found this photograph. Dresden was considered, and is, one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. It was considered Venice of the North. It was completely devastated in the Allied bombings in 1945. The city was leveled. And you can see the catastrophes of the 20th century emanating from Germany and the nemesis, what happened to the city. So I won a competition to design, really, to recreate the Military History Museum, which was always on that site. The site had always this arsenal, this U-shaped building, which was there already in the 19th century, end of 19th century. Very quickly became a museum, Military Museum of Germany, the largest museum in Germany. It was a museum of Saxony, museum of the Kaiser, museum of the Nazis, museum of the Russians, museum of East Germany, and then after unification of Germany, what do we do with this? So my thought was, well, everybody in the competition, this is still during construction, everybody in the competition said, let's build something in the back of the building, restore the building. I said, no. In a democracy, you shouldn't hide the military. You should expose the military. Military is part of a democracy. You shouldn't hide them behind walls. You should project them out into the city, and the projection is off-center in a very particular direction. The building is self-similar and pointing to the place from which Dresden was devastated and bombed in those Allied bombings. I wanted people to know that what they are seeing is a new city, not the same city that was there. It's rebuilt in many ways, but it's a result of the destruction of the city and the catastrophes of history of Germany, German militarism. And so actually this vector falls exactly, the armory tells you a horizontal story of history from the 12th century, 13th century knights of Germany, all the way to today. German military is in Afghanistan and so on. So it interrupted exactly in the chronology between 1914 and 1945. And then it's a totally different space, completely different, there it is. You can see in this model cutaway, this vector is completely vertical, oblique, completely different material, has a totally different sense of place, while the restored armory is horizontal and has all the activities. And what is in the center of this building? What is in this vector? There are no answers, there are questions. Why do people follow evil leaders? Why do people follow totalitarian ideas? What happens to women and children during war? What happens to people in war? So that's really part of it. And then it's cut through that horizontal history that is so fascinating. So there it is. I restored this building. It was really almost vandalized by the East Germans. The etc. was taken from the center. It was really really vandalized. I restored it back to its armory state at 19th century. And then there is that vector, which also has the observatory, where you can ascend and look at the city in a very peculiar and special way. The building goes through an entire building. It's not just a facade. It really moves through the opacity of history to emerge transparently on the top. And in the old building, you have the old exhibitions, the old history told in an interesting way. And then you can see the building just cuts through the column structure completely. It's all a column and arch structure. It cuts radically, but without really destroying much, or almost nothing of the facade. Just two lines are cut through which this vector is projected. And you ascend either by elevators or by stairs up to the top. And there are exhibitions. I never knew about the exploitation of animals in wars. We know Hannibal and the elephants, and we know lions, but I didn't realize that bees and monkeys and bacteria have been harnessed by evils of the military sense to destroy the world. So exploitation of animals, what an interesting exhibit. I learned so much there, and I presented the object. This is a helicopter, military, in ways that are really not aestheticized at all. They are threatening. They are not a pleasant way. It's not like looking at equipment. It's understanding what military technology is in wars. And the questions that are raised by these exhibitions is why war in the first place? We have the V2 rockets. It's a very somber but interesting place. I didn't want to make it just about weapons, but really about the experience of what happens to people and what falls from the sky, what falls on top of you. And I worked with very good exhibition designers. So it's a very continuous, fluid relationship between objects. For example, toys, military toys, which are used. And you can see on the left the old staircase, which is in the center, the 19th century staircase, which are incorporated. So it's really, you travel through time and through space with these questions. And then you ascend to the upper level where there's a history of cities bombed from Dresden. Wieliczka in Poland came from Poland. So Wieliczka was completely, Warsaw was devastated in the bombings. Many cities in Rotterdam completely destroyed. So that's the story of the bombed cities of Europe. Coventry in England. And then you can go outside. You can, I don't know whether I skipped one here. Yes. You can go outside and you get that sense of reality. You're projected, you're suspended high up, projected outward. You can see the Frauenkirche, the great Baroque church being reconstructed. You don't see it in a picture window either. You see it through the slots, through the kind of relentlessness of where you are, that armor of the building. But there's a sense of tension between where you are, where it's pointing to. It's pointing at the stadium from which Dresden was destroyed. It's pointing to the resurrected city. And it's a story without having to say many words. People have their own feelings, their own sense of not sentimentalizing where they are, understanding the tragedy and evils, but also the future as something positive. And then you have the juxtaposition of these two buildings, really. And I'm really glad that this is a very popular museum. It used to attract only people interested in buffs who like military stuff, military history. But now there's a restaurant, place for kids. It's important to be engaged in military history. It's not just for things behind walls. People should, because military in a democracy, people are responsible for it. It's our decisions which make war or peace. And so here it is at night, and it's a very prominent building. It's one of the, maybe the only contemporary building in a city which is completely nostalgic about its destruction. So everything is Baroque or neo-Baroque or fake Baroque, I should say. But I think it has changed some attitudes in the city. People say, you know, it's good to have contemporary things, and there's a lot to see here and learn from. Metamorphosis is another interesting word because it's not just transformation, it's a deeper change of something into something else. And I had a chance to work in Milan, a city that I live also in and I love. In the center of the city, the site that used to be the fairgrounds of the Fiera di Milano moved out to the suburbs, the big complex for exhibitions. And this central site in the city, which is really a historical city, became available. And I did the master plan. I won a competition with what to do with this site. In the center, you have a green piazza. Really change it into a park with 3 new scales of places, skyscrapers work. And I'm working, you can see that all around it are neighborhoods. How do you tie it? How do you make a place out of it without just making it banal? How do you create green spaces, green piazza, not just a concrete piazza or asphalt piazza? And Milan is a city, ancient city, of course. You know, the Edict of Milan, back, it's the first city to become Christian. It's Romanesque, it's got Baroque, it's got Renaissance, it's got modern, it's got Mussolini, it's got contemporary architecture. It's very, very interesting to create, and that's one of the things, to create housing, large, massive housing in the site. So how do you do it? How do you create a sense of place, modern housing with villas on top, a whole complex. There are many buildings, it's just the first part of it. And at the same time, a character with the geometry while, of course, having apartments really functional and working well for all the reasons, and create new sense of light, place. You can't get this in the ancient buildings of Milan because they're built with a different sense of order and with a different sense of topography, a different sense of what is a view. But you can see that it is possible to shape a building without making a building expensive, without making a building non-functional, and at the same time put the screens, create apartments which are really good. And I'm building another tower, the Park Tower, which is also part of it, which stands in this complex. So you can see a new scale of Milan. And I always say that today in the world, it's not countries that are competing, it's cities. I'm also designing the central tower. On the side, on one side is Zaha Hadid's towers, on the other one is Isozaki Tower. I'm doing the central tower, which is based on this curving geometry, bringing the piazza really into prominence, and it's under construction. It's soon will be realized. So you get a sense of metamorphosis of an ancient city, really moving forward into the future with a museum of mine in the front. Another project that I called Heritage, a project in China. I've not done very much in China because I never felt comfortable working there, but I was approached by a client who had a very ethical and a radical idea. Vanke Corporation, the biggest real estate company, biggest steel company, asked me to do the first privately funded museum of history for the public of China. And this was the perfect site because this site was the site that really brought modernity to China. Zhang Zhidang died in 1909, just around the Xinhai Revolution, brought industry, steel industry to China and created the railway network, created really modernity in China. And this museum really in Wuhan, which is devoted to Zhang Zhidang, to the new city of Wuhan. And I had a good fortune to build this building, which is really a gateway to this old sector of factories, steel factories is a model of it. You can see how it's organized from the Zhang Zhidang exhibit to the industry to Wuhan to many different spaces that the museum has. And it stands really within this factory district, which will be reconfigured, renovated. Of course, you will see many high skyscrapers here, probably in a short time. But the museum is a combination of many historical fragments of Wuhan, which have to do with ships, with the Yangtze River, with the gateway to the community, with a very exciting piece of architecture in this city. And this building is under construction. You can see there's a lot of steel because it's a steel company. And you can see that that the landscape is very important here to create really a piazza, a place for people to gather. There's a theater, there's performances outside. So exhibition with a gigantic window really overlooking the site, and a building that is very expressive of really the power and the energy of industry in China today and its historical connection to the 19th century. Risky is another word that architects are completely averse to. You know, you can take risks in science, risks in art, but architecture, please don't take any risk. But I think without a risk, it's not worth practicing anything, because life is a risk. So I really believe in that. And when I designed the Denver Art Museum, I thought of this form. It's inspired by the Rocky Mountains, and I love Denver. I love the pioneering spirit of that part of our country. To create a building that stands as an extension to the historical buildings of Denver, which itself is a new city, and create spaces that sort of ascend beyond the known. Their perspective is sharp. It's not a building that is anesthetizing you to art. It's a building that is as radical as the art which is shown inside of it. And I think that's part of it. I call it two lines going for a walk, because it's a continuous conversation between culture and nature. And you can see on the right side the beautiful Geopanti building, which is more like an office building with small floor plates. There's really no gathering space. So the Board of Trustees, the curators wanted a space for exhibitions, for mega exhibitions, for Western art, but also for contemporary installation art and all sorts of things. And really a new sense of recreating this area. And I think that was part of it, that the area was just parking lots, really next to the state capitol. But how do you create spaces that echo this beautiful space of Denver, of the Rockies? So you can see some of the installations, some of the exhibits. You can see, I can move this. Also more conventional spaces for large exhibits, projection spaces. I also created a piazza. I was able to create, I suggested closing a street, and I also suggested in the competition to put housing. It's not all affordable housing, but there's a component of affordable housing in it, and I was able to build. There were developers who were interested in doing it. So there it is, the housing part, which is actually screening a large public garage for thousands of cars. So you can take the program and recreate it into making a place, and I'm very proud that now this is a hub of art. This was just really a no man's land, so to speak, but it's such a beautiful area with the historical Golden Dome, with the beautiful Michael Graves Library, with the Geopanti building, with the new piazza, really a new sense of resurgence of Denver. Okay, now I come to the last project. I'm running out of time. I call it Rebirth. It's maybe one of the most important projects I ever had a chance to work on. Very often people ask me, where was I on 9/11? It's clear. And it's such a strange coincidence. You never know. But after so many years of, I moved to Berlin to realize the Jewish Museum. The Jewish Museum opened to the public on September 11, 2001. And I remember that morning going to my studio and saying, this is the first day I don't really have to think of history, of Germany, of Jewish history, because people can enter the museum. At 10 o'clock, they have entered the museum. By 2:30 that afternoon, 2:38 to be exact, the Jewish Museum closed its doors to the public. It was closed for 3 days. And that's when I realized the connection. And I, at that very moment, said, I want to go back to Manhattan. I grew up in the Bronx. I want to go back to, I had no idea why, what, but I wanted to be there. And indeed, that happened to me. That I won the competition for the master plan. And I called it Memory Foundations, because what is it? It's about the memory of the day. It's definitely a day that changed the world. The world is totally a different world. We travel differently, we think differently, the world appears differently, there are wars, there are different things that are a result of that day. So I thought it was about memory. It was about those who perished, thousands of people, 3,000 people from over 90 countries, over 90 different countries. Died there. At the same time, I thought it was foundation for New York. It's not just looking backward. We have to make it something fantastic, something that is as vibrant as America, as its freedoms, as its democracy. And that's really why I call it Memory Foundations. And I based it on many things. I based it on not just fulfilling the program. You'll remember that at that time, the mayor of New York wanted only low buildings. There were many different ideas. Most of my colleagues in the finals of the competition created megastructures, big buildings in the center of the site, very big buildings. I thought nothing should be really built in the middle of the site where people perished. It has never been declared a sacred site, but to me it's sacred because people perish there. You can't build on it. It's not really a piece of real estate. And I wanted to distribute the buildings in the sketch, really like the torch of the Statue of Liberty around the site. Not just the tallest buildings possible, but in fact the lowest buildings. I wanted to distribute the 10 million square feet of density into many buildings, not into one building or two buildings. So the buildings are lower, so that streets have better character, no wind tunnels, better sense of the beauty of New York. At the same time, I wanted to use the underground. The underground, which I'll show you in a minute how it works. Here it is. On the left is a sketch, which I did. Just a sketch, just an idea. And on the right is the latest rendering. And that's, I think, what the project is about. It's how do you get there from an idea, from something very modest, to a reality that needs to have consensus. Please remember, there's no one client for this. Families of the victims are stakeholders. There are thousands and thousands of people whose loved ones perished on that day. There is the Port Authority that owns the site and leases the site to developers and their own architects. The Port Authority itself is ruled by the governors of New York and New Jersey because of the PATH trains. The mayor of New York controls the streets of New York and that place. MTA authorities control the subways, and PATH train authorities the PATH trains. So you need a consensus to build a project. You can't just make a nice drawing and say, fine, take it or leave it. You have to be involved. And it's highly emotional, highly political, highly strategic. What can one do? And here is my thinking, just from these modest sketches. How to mark the September 11th day, where the firemen and police came, what happened there, how to dispose of the building, how to make it accessible to the public, how to reconnect the streets, which were disconnected in the original Twin Towers scheme. It's highly political because you're not working just for one client. I don't show this photograph out of vanity, but every decision is under scrutiny, under great controversy. There's nothing you can do here, and there are great forces. Forces of money, forces of power, forces of politics, pushing the project in different directions. But I really, really am a believer in democracy because, many people said, you're compromising, you're doing this and that, but I believe in that. I believe you have to work with everybody to share an idea and to bring people together into something that people do share and deeply believe, and that's exactly what has happened. That's the original scheme of memory foundations. That's one of the original models, and there is the site itself. You can see it's a 16-acre site. It's a small site. About half of it I left empty. 8 acres are public space. And that's important to me. That, it be public. It's not just for people lucky enough to work on those beautiful office buildings. And, I grew up in the Bronx, I said. My parents worked in the sweatshops of New York. My mother worked in the garment industry. My father was a printer on Stone Street. They were always in the subways. They had to work very hard. I often thought, what would this be for my parents? They would never be in those office buildings. They'd be on the streets of New York, like most New Yorkers. So the streets have to be beautiful. Subways, the connection, the transportation hub. That's how the project is constructed. And for architects, I just show you this diagram, that the art of the project is not the buildings that you see. That's kind of relatively easy. It's the 75 feet underground, because that's where the life of New York is. That's where the trains come. That's where the movement across the Hudson River comes. That's where the foundations of the buildings. That's where security is. That's where everything happens. And so that's really maybe the most complex part of the scheme, how to make it work. And you know about the slurry wall. The slurry wall is that incredible wall that we should have never seen. And I remember on that, and I have to tell you an anecdote, because it was on a November day, during the competition, I was with the other 6 finalists, famous architects, friends of mine. We were in One Liberty Plaza looking down on the site. Gray day, raining, miserable. And somebody said, does anybody want to go down to the site? And every architect said, no, it's better. We have a better view of it from the top. But Nina and I decided we want to go down. And I have to tell you, my life changed. As I went down on this ramp, down to this wall, I suddenly understood what the site was about. It wasn't about glass and gleaming buildings. It was about people. It was about memory. And I touched this wall, and the engineer said, that's the slurry wall. And, in all my years of studying architecture, I didn't know much about slurry walls. But it's a huge foundation. It's a dam. On one side is Hudson River with all its pressure pushing. And on the other side is the bedrock of New York. And had this wall collapsed, all of the subways would have been flooded. I thought this is something that people should understand. This is about the bedrock of New York. This is about something that is built. And that's indeed what will be now part of the September 11 Museum, which is underground. There's a visitor center up above, which is only a way to get into the underground. But the underground is vast, and it's powerful. You see the foundations, which should have never been seen, and yet it's the only foundation that has ever been exposed of a living entity up above. We see foundations in Rome, in Greece, in Jerusalem, of buildings that are gone. But it's very difficult to expose a living foundation because, you know, living foundations are made to put something on top of them. But I had friends at the Port Authority, engineers, who liked the idea of memorializing something so powerful as the effort of so many people to build the foundations of the World Trade Center. And indeed, you will see it through the visitor center as you descend and ascend backwards. It's a very powerful experience that will really give a sense to those who are born after. And so many people have been born after these events. The memorial site itself, of course, is the footprints, exactly the size of the Twin Towers, and the names engraved on the sides, and the waterfalls. And when I first proposed the waterfalls, there was an outcry in all the tabloids in New York. They said it's the most ridiculous idea to bring Niagara Falls in the center of Lower Manhattan. But I'm glad I did, and I'm glad that Michael Arad's memorial follows that idea, because it brings acoustical sense that screams the busy sound of New York, and also nature, that the sort of falls. You follow the fall of the water, and you'll see it in a different way from underground. It's very moving. And here it is, one of the sketches, and you see there not just the 1776. I thought the tower should not be just an infinitely tall tower because nobody would have money to build it anyway. So it's rather a modest tower, the Freedom Tower. But its ascent to 1776 I thought was important. And in the sky, it's not the height of a building, it's the height of an aspiration of a building. 1776, the date of the Declaration of Independence is the first document of human rights in the world. And I thought that's something in the sky that will be forever permanent and important for people to know about. And the Wedge of Light, an additional public space from Broadway. You know, there's so many people will come towards the west from the east. I thought we need another space. And it's a space that is really connected just by light. 8:46 a.m. when the first tower was struck, and 10:28 when the second tower collapsed, really creates the edges of tower number 2 and the center of the PETH terminal. And you can see it here. The PETH terminal is turned exactly this oval towards that line, and you'll get perfect light. You know, September 11th was a beautiful day, but even on a gray day, you'll see that the light is the key as part of the memory of the site. And you can see the station going up. It's going to be a very civic, important sense of being on the site. And you can see the sketch here of the importance of light. And I just want to tell you that in this site, there is the whole downtown of a major American city, 10 million square feet of office space, 5 million square feet of infrastructure and culture, 2 million square feet of additional. It's the entire downtown of Baltimore, downtown of Denver could be put into here. So how do you create a space that really is for people, that is interesting, that is symbolic, that even within the grid echoes the torch of liberty? That's the view from my window, from our studio. We are right at Ground Zero, and we live just north of it. So I see it, I have to tell you, every morning, early in the morning from the house, and every evening when I return from work, past the site, and it's changed a lot from this desperate destruction to something that is vivid, something that brings life back. And that's what the site is about. It's about the victory of life over the evil deeds. That's what it's about. And, you know, I end here where I started. I was an immigrant to New York. I came by ship like most immigrants in the older times. Now people fly to New York. But I was lucky to come by a boat. And I tell you, I was woken up early in the morning by my mother. My sister and I were woken up. You're going to see the Statue of Liberty. You're going to see New York. And I have to tell you, as a 13-year-old, there's nothing to prepare you for what that means. That statue, as you come by boat, you know, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. That's what it's written there by Emma Lazarus. And the skyline of New York is the proof of liberty, of freedom. That's what America is about. That's what the site is about. Thank you. very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a few minutes for questions. And as I mentioned, we have 2 microphones here. So please don't be shy. It is okay.
In regards to your Kobogen in Dusseldorf, you made an emphasis on the purpose of vegetation as well as the interaction with that vegetation. So with this continuous growth of the urban population, as well as the need for sustainable buildings in terms of material efficiency as well as the orientation you mentioned, what do you believe the future holds for the purpose of vegetation in these structures in order to supply these dense and unsustainable cities with the natural resources they need?
If I understand your question, it's a question about nature and buildings?
Yes.
I think it's a very important question. Many people think that sustainable architecture, green architecture, is just something green. It's a style of architecture. It's not. It's how you make a building, as you said. It's how you use 21st century technology, how you even use ancient techniques to create a building that really is good. But ultimately, to me, a good building is a building that people want to keep, that can be reused. And the buildings we love, we want to reuse, are buildings that have a character. And their uses have changed, the uses of these buildings have changed, but the buildings are well constructed and continue to live. So to me, that is really architecture. Architecture is always to do with nature. And certainly in dense environments, we need to think of new ways to enliven, to bring nature in a more vivid way, even to high-density activities like shopping or office building.
So do you believe we can expect to see higher values of vegetation intertwined?
Oh, absolutely. I think landscape and the notion that we are not just living in a concrete jungle, but that survival in high-density cities will depend on the character of those cities. And vegetation may not be on the ground. It might be high up. In Singapore, I brought it high up, and those levels of the bridges have many trees. It's always a challenge. There's always a premium to pay initially, but I think the value is immense because we won't be able to survive if we don't have any birds. We won't be able to survive if we don't have insects, if we don't have grass, if we don't have the poetry of relationship to something bigger than we are.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Let's follow at that end. You will be number 4 at this side. Thank you.
As a landscape architecture undergrad myself, I know that in the future I'm going to have to work with architects, planners, engineers, and other professions. And I was wondering, you said you work with Martha Schwartz. I know that Peter Walker did the 9/11 site. When you find a landscape architect to work with, do you find somebody who shares the same values that you do? Or do you both come to the table and just agree to work towards a common goal for the site?
Well, you have to, I think, in any master plan and any large project, you have to work with creativity. Creativity is the key. You don't come with a prescriptive program which limits everyone's imagination. You have to make something that allows people to really invent and go beyond sort of the obvious. So yes, I think in every project you need to have partners that, whether it's Hargraves in Singapore, Martha Schwartz, you need to work with people who share also your values. You can't just work with somebody who has an aesthetic sense.
So in what point in an architect's career do you feel that they can begin to sort of go against the grain and start to develop their own style? You mentioned risk as one of your
I'm probably the wrong person to ask this because I always feel that I've lived my life exactly in reverse. Most people start with a small building, and then they have a chance to do larger building, and then after a while, they have a chance to meditate. That's what the Greeks said, and the last part of your life should be meditation, reflection on what you did during your life. I did the opposite. I had plenty of time of reflection without anything to do, and now I have to sort of catch up on the other side of it. So, yeah, I think you should always go against the grain because common sense is not something that has been established objectively as being a public good. So I think one has to question. And I've always thought that we know that questions are important in science. Yes, there would be no science without fundamental questions. The wonder, why? Why is something like that? There's questions in philosophy, questions in literature, questions in economics. They give even... Architecture should ask questions. And if we don't ask the questions, then the architecture should ask the questions for us. And so I believe that architecture is a philosophical discipline as well as a discipline dealing with building.
Thank you.
So you've been a professional musician, and so that means you must have been used to rigorous practicing and training and hours of just repetition until you get it right. And you must have. So how did you adapt that to your creativity process through architecture?
That's a very good question. It's true. You can't play music without practicing for hours and hours, and from having a discipline where you have to get to know something. You can't just play. Even Mozart, started when he was young. He had an advantage, but he died also at 33. So you have to practice a lot. Music has taught me a lot. I don't feel I've given up music. Many people think, well, I had another life. I was a musician. But architecture is music in the following way. First of all, it's very much like music in its precision. If you have a wrong note, everybody can hear it. It's not something you need to have an education. Second of all, it's scientific, and it's very rigorous mathematically. Third of all, it all doesn't count if it doesn't have an emotional impact. If you hear a piece of music and all you're hearing is the correctness of technique, it's just a performance of absurdity. You want to be moved by the music. You don't want to think of what Bach put. And Bach, by the way, was one of my favorite architects, put even his name, B-A-C-H. He put all sorts of mystical things into his music, which only those who are musicologists can actually decipher. But the music is very rigorous. So, and also music is produced very similar to architecture. You need a big team. You're not the person who's playing the solo. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of people developing a site. Hundreds of thousands, maybe, who are involved in something like Ground Zero or big sites like Korea. You need to empower everybody to play, and to play correctly according to a score that is very precise, that also gives possibility of interpretation. So, yeah, I think music taught me one thing, that as Mozart said, this is the most interesting thing. When he died, apparently, I found this in 2 books that purport to be true biography of Mozart. He died very young. His last words apparently were, "I am beginning to see that music has a possibility." That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Libeskind. Where would you have to see yourself in the next 20 years as an architect, and what do you see yourself doing and accomplishing in the near future here?
What a good question. I wish I could answer it.
That's
It's not predictable. Life is not predictable. I was on a complete different track in my life. When things happen to you that are very unexpected. When I won the competition for the Jewish Museum in Berlin, I was off to the Getty Center. I had no intention to be an architect. I was trained as an architect, but I thought it was much more interesting to draw, to write, and then I just stopped in Berlin just to pick up the so-called prize, the certificate, this kind of little exhibition of the 150 different projects. And as we walked out, my wife, who is always much smarter than I am, as we left, said to me, "What are you going to do now?" Because it's like 2 roads going to different places. Going to Santa Monica, having a house, having assistants, working on your work, or going and starting to be serious about building a building that no one had any intention to build. No one had any intention to build such a building. And I said to her, Berlin, let's stay in Berlin under one condition, that you would join me as my partner in architecture. And she said, "I've never been in an architect's office." And I said, "The same thing applies to me. I've never." So, but it's true. I only worked like one day here, one day there, and I said, "It's not really for me. I don't really like it. It's too boring." But in truth, I don't know what will happen to me. you never know. You know, whatever plans you have there, they will be changed by accidents and by kind of destiny. So it's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to have to be protective of Daniel's schedule, so probably we have enough questions already in line. So we will just try to finish with those that are waiting there. Try to be brief.
All right. In the beginning, you mentioned the hand versus the computer. What do you see or anticipate as new challenges for emerging designers?
I think that it's a good question. What do you anticipate for emerging designers? I would expect what you least expect. You know, things will happen, and technologies will come that will completely alter the way we do things and the way we see things. But I think the challenge will be to remain grounded in reality, because you can have a whole system of an eclipse of reality. Reality can be eclipsed by a secondary reality where human beings don't count, where individuality is under pressure, where freedom is threatened. So I think those are, you know, kind of the eternal values. You read the Bible, you read the ancient texts of the Greeks or of any other people. I think that's what will be the challenge, to maintain, to be grounded in something deeper than ourselves. And call it whatever you want. Call it the true world, which is not, as my favorite thinker of all time, Shakespeare, says in Hamlet, at one point, when the ghost appears, Hamlet says to Horatio, you know, Horatio, there is more to heaven and earth than in all our philosophy. And that's what I think.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Libeskind. What do you feel is the future of adaptive reuse? Do you think it should be an amalgamation of our desire to create a more sustainable environment along with the renovation and restoration of existing buildings?
Well, I definitely, you know, buildings, I work a lot, as I said, in Italy and now in a new project in Rome, where you can hardly build a new building. So the entire practice depends on appreciation of ancient buildings. But again, Rome has some great buildings that have withstood the catastrophes of time. But I think what you're right. It's not. It's a more holistic way of viewing what architects do, I think, or planners do, because ultimately it's not about the buildings. It's not even how nice the building. It's not about aesthetics of buildings. It's more about the ethics of building. How do we treat others through our buildings? And I always believe that a building which is good is not a building for us. It's for someone else. You know, writers don't write for the existing audience. They write for the unborn reader. If they're good. If they're bad, they write for, you know, bestsellers. So, yeah.
Hi, Mr. Libeskind. My question is, how do you present your ideas to your clients, you know, convincing them that the character of your buildings fits in with the context and, you know, will work for them?
Fitting into the context is a good idea. You know, there is a notion that there is an existing context, but the context is alive with voices that you cannot hear. You know, when I was working on a greenfield site in Connecticut, you know, it looks like just a perfect green site, but there is history on that site. There are native peoples. There is history. Every site, there's no tabula rasa. So I think that's one of the ways to do it, is to get in touch with the context, the living context. It's not the context that is a cartoon of history. It's not a context that has been stabilized, because every context depends on how we view it, what we do with it, what is speaking to us. And as I said, whether it's Berlin or Dresden or other places or New York, you always see something that no one was really prepared to hear. Look, in the construction of the Ground Zero at New York, we found a boat that sunk in the 18th century, a wooden boat, and it's going to be on the exhibit in the September 11 Museum. So I think the idea that there is a context that is fixed, how do you convince a client? I think clients are very intelligent. They want something interesting. They want a connection with tradition, rightfully so. But I think clients are also very inventive. They don't want, I don't think clients just want the kitsch, nostalgic reproduction of history. There are too many architects who just pretend that we are now in the 18th century, you know, and create a building with a gable roof and nice bricks, and you think, wow, it's great. But I don't think that's the real context. The real context is much more powerful, because the earth is shaking, and there, you know, there are events going on, and I think that's the real context, and that's why I never liked pretentious architecture, you know, sort of like, you know, nationalist architecture or whatever style of architecture you would say.
Thank you.
Mr. Libeskind, I like your boots, first of all. I guess my question would be, there's no denying that we as designers are not going to reinvent the wheel. So in a world full of individuals aspiring to innovate, how does one escape the natural sense of ambiguity when designing?
How does one escape ambiguity? You can't. I think ambiguity is part of the human condition. Ambiguity is part of what we do, and I think that's what I meant by a risk, that by opening a new direction, of course it's risky. Of course it might go against you know, the wisdom of the moment, but give it time. You know, architecture is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It takes a long time to register. It's not like just something immediate. It takes time. And to me, the building really succeeds not when it's built and everybody has a, you know, review in the New York Times or appears on the cover of a magazine. The building is good many, many years later when it starts changing how we perceive the whole environment. Look, Kafka, one of my favorite writers, Franz Kafka, he wrote the story called Metamorphosis. He said the good writers, the great writers, begin to write after they die. And I think he's right. They begin to work, the bad writers are doing their lifetime, but the great writers you read maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of years after the texts were written. And look how many things we appreciate that were done thousands of years ago when we come to admire the genius, the mastery of people in all fields. So yes, I think the ambiguity is part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Libeskind. I wanted to ask, we're all students here. We came here to learn not only about structure, but also about ourselves. And my question was, as an architect, designer, sculptor, how did you come about with your style, the one that you wanted to push every day and to keep discovering more often every day that you worked?
How did I learn? Well, first of all, I was lucky to have great teachers. You know, I had teachers like John Haydag and Peter Eisenman, Richard Meyer, and Aldo Rossi, many others who were kind of masters. But at the end, I think you're right what you said. Education is not out there. It also has to do with you. Without that moment of bringing yourself into it, it will be just a dry object. So I do say that every person is creative, not only students. Every person has creativity. It's to bring that creativity somehow to focus, to a dilemma even, and to be stuck. Sometimes to fail is not so bad, you know. You have to try different things, not by picking up, you know, what is so-called successful in the air, but testing yourself against yourself. And everybody has a soul, you know, not just a mind. Everybody has a soul. And I believe that that's the key, that if you delve deeper, you realize that there is a path. And I've always denied the gurus who tell you there's a goal. Go for your goal. You know, there's a goal, get it. You know, go do everything to get the goal. I said, best to have no goal. You don't have any goals. Have a path. Follow the path without being pulled to the left or to the right. You know, and just try to walk that path, and you'll encounter things that you don't expect, for sure. Good and bad. But I think, I'm not a Zen philosopher, but I think they said something like that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Hello, Mr. Libeskind. Excuse me. If you could turn back the clock, what would be the most powerful recommendation you could make to your 20-year-old self, or for that matter, a young architecture student today?
In other words, what would I advise?
Yes.
First of all, I'm not wise enough to advise anybody. I would say you have to challenge yourself. You have to doubt that much of what is in the air is perhaps right. You have to doubt. Descartes, one of my favorite philosophers, said, I doubt everything. I doubt everything I've been taught in the Jesuit schools. I doubt what they told me about God. I doubt everything. I doubt to the deepest point, to the fact that I exist. I exist. That's my. So I think I would say you have to take a risk. You have to somehow get yourself into trouble. If you don't get yourself into trouble, almost with every building I got into trouble. I don't think I've done a single building where people said, oh, that's good, that's great. Fine. Every building I've done, every plan I've done, they were up in arms. This should not be done. This is breaking the rules. This is not good. I think getting into trouble is part of it. Not for yourself, but in front of greater authorities. And you have to, the beauty of our world is we have access to so many incredible things through new technology. We can read ancient texts. We can have materials that are unfathomable. We can get into parts of the world where no Marco Polo was even able to get to. So I think you have to use your imagination, and everybody has it. And, it's an adventure. I always thought architecture used to, in the old times, attract adventurers. Brunelleschi and Bramante and Alberti and the old architects of the pyramids, architects of the pagodas, architects of the great mosque, were all kind of adventurers. They had a program, but it was an intellectual adventure. I think I recommend that you take an adventure. Now, why should only Wall Street have the adventurers? It should be the arts. And I think the artists that I really, architects, artists, philosophers, I admire are those adventurers that have gone out beyond the limit to see something that could even be disturbing, strange, a kind of premonition also of what could be.
Thank you, sir. And may I just personally thank you for the wonderful work you've done at restoring our ground zero.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.